D-Day. The greatest landing in history, causes and background. By early 1944, World War II had entered its fifth brutal year. The tide of the war was turning against Nazi Germany. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet Red Army was advancing westward, driving the Germans out of Ukraine and pushing toward Poland. In the Mediterranean, the Allies had landed in Sicily, captured Rome, and were slowly fighting their way north through Italy. But in Western Europe, German occupation remained unbroken. France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark were still under the swastika's shadow. For the Allies, opening a second front in Western Europe was essential, not only to defeat Germany faster, but to relieve the enormous pressure on the Soviet Union. At the Tehran Conference in late 1943, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin agreed. The Allies would launch a cross-channel invasion by mid-1944. The operation would be called Operation Overlord. Choosing the location was a matter of intense debate. The most direct route was across the Strait of Dover, into the Pas-de-Calais. But German defenses there were far too strong. Normandy, further west, offered advantages. Its beaches were suitable for landing craft, its defenses lighter than Calais. And once ashore, the Allies could break out into the open countryside. Hitler, aware of the possibility of invasion, ordered the construction of the Atlantic Wall. This was a vast network of bunkers, gun emplacements, mines, and obstacles, stretching over 2,600 kilometers of coastline, manned by hundreds of thousands of troops. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, tasked with strengthening the wall, warned, "The first 24 hours of the invasion will be the most critical. For the Allies, as well as for Germany, it will be the longest day." Allied planners knew that breaking through would require overwhelming force and absolute secrecy. British codebreakers at Bletchley Park were already decrypting German Enigma communications. The intelligence they gathered revealed troop movements, supply issues, and coastal defenses. A massive deception plan, Operation Bodyguard, was set in motion. Its most famous element, Operation Fortitude, created the illusion of a huge invasion force aimed at Calais. Fake radio transmissions, double agents, and even inflatable tanks convinced the Germans that Normandy was only a diversion. In occupied France, the French resistance stepped up their efforts. Rail lines were sabotaged, German convoys ambushed, and intelligence on troop locations sent back to London. The weather became a critical factor. The English Channel's storms could delay the invasion for weeks. Allied meteorologists searched for a narrow window. With a low tide at dawn, light winds, and enough moonlight for airborne landings. Meanwhile, disagreements among the Allied commanders had to be resolved. Churchill favored a Mediterranean focus, while American generals pushed for a direct assault across the Channel. Eventually, General Dwight D. Eisenhower was appointed Supreme Allied Commander. His task, to coordinate land, sea, and air forces from the U.S., Britain, Canada, and other Allied nations. In one of the final pre-invasion meetings, Eisenhower told his men, "The eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you." Hitler, in contrast, assured his generals, "We will throw them back into the sea." In the months before June 1944, both sides prepared for a battle that would decide the fate of Europe. Intelligence and military preparation. Operation Overlord was unlike any military undertaking in history. It required not just soldiers and ships, but a vast web of intelligence, deception, logistics, and coordination. The planning rooms in London buzzed with maps, scale models, and classified reports. Every beach in Normandy was studied, every tide chart examined, every potential landing site debated in detail. The British Special Operations Executive, SOE, coordinated with the French resistance. Agents risked their lives, parachuting into occupied territory, to gather intelligence on German defenses, and to train local sabotage teams. One of the most critical assets was Double Cross, a network of double agents feeding false information to the Germans. Perhaps the most famous was Juan Pujol Garcia, codenamed Garbo. He convinced the German High Command that the main invasion would be at the Pas de Calais. Meanwhile, the Allies assembled the largest invasion fleet in history. Over 5,000 ships, including battleships, cruisers, destroyers, landing craft, and transport vessels. The ports of southern England became massive staging grounds. Soldiers from the US, Britain, Canada, and other allied nations trained relentlessly. Specialized vehicles were developed, including the British Hobart's Funnies, modified tanks equipped with flamethrowers, mine flails, and bridge-laying gear, designed to overcome the beach defenses. Airborne divisions prepared for their critical role. The U.S. 82nd and 101st Airborne, and the British 6th Airborne would be dropped behind enemy lines hours before the landings, to capture bridges, destroy key roads, and sow chaos among German defenders. Secrecy was absolute. Troops were confined to their camps in the days before the invasion. Mail was censored. Movement was restricted. Eisenhower demanded unity among his multinational force. He met with commanders daily, resolved disputes, and stressed the importance of timing. A single delay in weather, tide, or landing order could doom the operation. Meteorologists became unlikely heroes. On June 4, 1944, a storm lashed the channel. The invasion was postponed by 24 hours, but on the evening of June 5th, a brief window of improved weather was predicted. Eisenhower made the fateful decision. Okay, let's go. Across England, soldiers boarded their ships and planes. Letters were written home, some in hope, others in quiet resignation. In the early hours of June 6th, the largest amphibious assault in history was about to begin. The landing and first clash. In the darkness of the early morning hours, June 6, 1944, the English Channel was alive with movement. Thousands of ships stretched from horizon to horizon. Their wakes foamed in the dim moonlight. Engines roared beneath the sound of crashing waves. At 0:15 hours, the first phase began. Allied paratroopers jumped into the night sky. The U.S. 82nd and 101st Airborne and the British 6th Airborne descended into occupied France. The drops were scattered. Some units landed miles from their intended zones, but small groups quickly gathered, destroying bridges, seizing crossroads, and ambushing German patrols. Meanwhile, the massive naval armada pushed closer to Normandy's beaches. 5 landing sectors had been designated: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. At 05:45, battleships and cruisers opened fire. The thunder of naval guns rolled across the water. Shells exploded on German bunkers, tearing through concrete and steel. In the air, hundreds of bombers pounded the coastline, but many bombs fell inland, missing their targets. As dawn broke, the landing craft began their final approach. At Utah Beach, strong currents pushed many craft off course, but U.S. forces adapted quickly, facing lighter resistance than expected. At Omaha Beach, however, the story was very different. The cliffs and bluffs loomed over the shoreline, heavily fortified with machine guns, mortars, and artillery. As the ramps dropped, Soldiers waded into chest-deep water, under withering fire. Many fell before reaching the sand. Medics worked frantically, pulling the wounded to cover. Engineers tried to clear mines and obstacles, while officers shouted for men to push forward. At Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches, British and Canadian troops fought through heavy resistance. In some places, armored vehicles bogged down in the sand. In others, infantry pushed inland rapidly, linking with paratroopers. By mid-morning, footholds had been secured on all 5 beaches, but casualties were high, especially at Omaha, where entire units were nearly wiped out. Still, the beachheads were now in Allied hands, and the long fight inland had just begun. Saw the turning point on D-Day. As the sun rose higher on June 6, 1944, the invasion of Normandy hung in the balance. Victory and disaster separated only by courage, chance, and persistence. At Omaha Beach, the scene was one of near catastrophe. Waves crashed against burning landing craft. Bodies floated in the tide, and German defenses, perched on the bluffs, poured fire into the helpless soldiers below. The first American waves had been slaughtered. Hundreds cut down before even reaching the sand. Others drowned under the weight of their equipment as they stepped off the ramps into deep water. The cries of the wounded echoed across the beach. German MG-42s rattled without pause. Mortar shells burst among the men. Artillery from hidden batteries rained destruction. Smoke and screams filled the air, and officers struggled desperately to restore order. But even in the chaos, small groups of survivors refused to give in. An American captain rallied his men, shouting, "We're dying here. We move or we perish." With grim determination, soldiers crawled through craters, dragging rifles through the sand, inching forward against impossible odds. Combat engineers risked everything, running into fire to plant explosives on obstacles. Some were killed instantly. Others succeeded, opening narrow passages for men and vehicles. The U.S. Rangers, trained for this moment, scaled the cliffs with ropes and grappling hooks, climbing hand over hand as German bullets snapped overhead. Reaching the top, they stormed the strongpoints with grenades and flamethrowers, silencing machine gun nests one by one. By midday, Omaha Beach was still a nightmare, but momentum had shifted. The German line began to crack, their ammunition running low, their commanders stunned by the sheer persistence of the assault. At Utah Beach, fortune favored the Americans. Strong currents had pushed many units off course, but General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., limping from old wounds, calmly declared, "We'll start the war from right here." His steady leadership reassured his men. Utah quickly became one of the most successful landings with relatively light casualties. At Gold and Juno, British and Canadian troops faced determined opposition, but their armored support, Hobart's funnies, specialized tanks, helped breach obstacles and suppress defenses. Canadian infantry at Juno advanced deeper inland than any other force on D-Day, though at heavy cost. On Sword Beach, British forces pressed toward Caen, a city of strategic importance. Its capture would open roads for tanks and cut German counterattacks, but resistance was stiff, and progress was slow. In the skies above, Allied air power dominated the battlefield. Squadrons of fighters strafed German convoys on the move. Bombers struck bridges and roads to delay reinforcements. The Luftwaffe barely appeared, crippled by earlier losses. Meanwhile, the French resistance carried out its most coordinated actions yet, cutting rail lines, derailing trains, ambushing supply columns. sending coded messages to London that confirmed German troop movements. Their sabotage slowed the enemy at a critical moment. Inside Hitler's headquarters, confusion reigned. Reports of landings poured in. But the Führer remained convinced this was only a diversion, that the real blow would fall at the Pas de Calais. He refused to release armored divisions stationed there. Precious hours were lost. And when orders finally came, it was too late. Allied air attacks and destroyed railroads delayed the panzers for days. Field Marshal Rommel, who had warned of precisely this danger, was absent in Germany, celebrating his wife's birthday. When he returned, the beaches were already lost. By nightfall on June 6th, the impossible had been achieved. Despite nearly 10,000 casualties, over 156,000 Allied soldiers had crossed the Channel, established a foothold nearly 15 miles inland, and breached Hitler's Atlantic Wall. Exhausted men dug in among hedgerows and villages, tending to the wounded, gathering ammunition, preparing for the inevitable counterattacks. While above them, parachutes still hung from trees, silent reminders of the cost of the day. Eisenhower received the reports with relief. Writing in his diary, "The tide has turned. The free men of the world are marching together to victory." The turning point had come, not in grand maneuvers, but in the courage of individuals, in the stubborn refusal to surrender, and in the belief that Europe could be freed, one bloody beach at a time. The days after the landing and the breakthrough. The morning of June 7th, 1944, dawned gray and heavy over Normandy. Rain clouds hung low, and the battlefield was littered with the wreckage of the greatest amphibious assault in history. On the beaches, thousands of men still crowded the sand, unloading supplies, tending to the wounded, burying the dead. Landing craft shuttled back and forth across the Channel, bringing in reinforcements, vehicles, ammunition, and food. The beaches themselves were transformed into vast logistical hubs. Bulldozers pushed aside wreckage, engineers built temporary roads of steel matting, cranes unloaded tanks directly from ships. But the fight was far from over. The Germans, though stunned, were regrouping along the hedgerows and villages of Normandy. Waffen-SS units, paratroopers, and panzer divisions prepared to counterattack. The terrain itself became a weapon. The famous bocage, dense hedgerows, sunken lanes, and stone farmhouses favored the defenders. German snipers hid among the trees. Machine guns fired from concealed barns. Mortars rained down on any open movement. At Omaha, the Americans inched inland only a few miles, suffering heavy casualties in bitter fights for each village, each crossroads. At Utah, progress was faster. The paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st linked up with the beach forces, securing bridges and cutting German routes. In the British sector, the drive toward Caen stalled. German Panzer Lehr Division and elements of the 21st Panzer countered fiercely, forcing the Allies into grinding attritional combat. The first days were marked not by sweeping advances, but by brutal, close-quarter fighting. Villages changed hands multiple times. Hedgerows became death traps. Tanks could not maneuver. Artillery was limited by the thick terrain. A Canadian soldier later recalled, "We didn't see the enemy until he was 30 yards away. Then it was grenades, rifles, and bayonets. It was like fighting through a green maze of death." Air power again played its role. Whenever German armor tried to move by day, Allied fighter bombers descended with rockets and bombs, destroying columns before they reached the front. But at night, the Germans moved. Convoys of reinforcements crept forward, bringing in Tigers, Panthers, and fresh infantry. every morning, the Allies faced new counterattacks. In London and Washington, leaders were anxious. The landings had succeeded, but the breakout was slow. Losses were mounting. Would the Allies bog down in Normandy, as they had in the trenches of 1914? Eisenhower pressed his commanders. Hold the line. Reinforce where needed. We must grind the enemy down. By mid-June, the Allies had brought ashore 500,000 men, 77,000 vehicles, and 100,000 tons of supplies. Artificial harbors, the mulberries, allowed unloading directly onto the beaches, while underwater pipelines, Pluto, began pumping fuel from England to France. Still, the Germans fought with ferocity. At Carentan, American paratroopers fought house to house to secure the town, linking Utah and Omaha. At Tilly-sur-Seulles, British forces clashed with Panzer-Lehr for days, with villages destroyed in the crossfire. Rommel, now back in command, urged Hitler to withdraw behind the Seine. But Hitler refused, declaring, "We will drive them into the sea. The Atlantic Wall has not failed. It has been betrayed." The days dragged into weeks. Every hedgerow became a battlefield, every farmstead a fortress. The Allies adapted, developing new tactics. Small squads using grenades, flamethrowers, and tank infantry coordination to clear each field. By the end of June, the beachhead was secure, but the real breakthrough had yet to come. Allied commanders knew that only by breaking into the open country could they unleash their full strength. And so the stage was set for the next great push, Operation Cobra, the breakout from Normandy, the shattering of German resistance in the West. The victory in Normandy did not come overnight. It was the result of weeks of brutal, grinding combat. But its strategic consequences were immense. By July 1944, the Allies had established a secure foothold in France, stretching from Cherbourg in the west to Caen in the east, an arc of liberated territory that continued to grow each day. For the first time since 1940, the Germans were on the defensive in Western Europe, forced to fight on multiple fronts, with the Soviet Red Army pushing relentlessly from the east. The political impact was equally profound. In London, Winston Churchill declared before Parliament, "This is not the end nor the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning." His words captured the cautious optimism of a nation weary of years of bombing, rationing, and loss. In Washington, Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed the American people in a radio broadcast. He asked them to join him in a prayer. "Almighty God, our sons, pride of our nation, have set upon a mighty endeavor to set free a suffering humanity." The message resonated deeply across the United States, binding the home front to the soldiers on the beaches. In Berlin, the reaction was shock and rage. Hitler fumed at his generals, accusing them of cowardice and betrayal. He demanded counterattacks that were impossible to execute, insisting that the Atlantic Wall had been lost, not by enemy strength, but by treachery. German propaganda tried to minimize the invasion, calling it a temporary setback. But the truth could not be hidden. The Reich's enemies were now on continental soil, and the myth of invincibility was shattered. Among the German high command, doubts grew. Field Marshal Rommel confided to his staff, "The war is lost unless we negotiate peace. Every day the Allies grow stronger, and we weaker." But such voices were drowned out by Hitler's fanatic refusal to retreat. The French population, long under occupation, greeted the landings with cautious hope. In villages across Normandy, civilians offered bread, water, and shelter to advancing Allied soldiers. Many paid with their lives when German reprisals followed. The resistance gained confidence. Their sabotage grew bolder. Entire rail lines were destroyed, bridges collapsed, German supply depots set ablaze. For the first time, collaborationist officials began to waver, sensing the tide of war had changed. Strategically, the Allies now had a springboard into Europe. The capture of Cherbourg provided a deep-water port, enabling the direct flow of supplies from America. Airfields were rapidly constructed, bringing Allied air power even closer to the front lines. In Moscow, Joseph Stalin sent messages of congratulations to his Western allies, though privately he pressured them to accelerate their advance. Every German division tied down in France was one less resisting the Soviet offensive in Operation Bagration, which, at that very moment, was annihilating Army Group Center in the east. The coordination between East and West, though strained, marked the emergence of a true coalition strategy, one that would eventually squeeze Nazi Germany from both directions until collapse was inevitable. For neutral nations, the Normandy landings were a signal. Spain, Sweden, and Turkey observed carefully, sensing that Germany's defeat was now only a matter of time. Diplomatic channels opened, with many preparing for a post-war world dominated not by the Axis, but by the Allies. The morale effect was perhaps the greatest of all. For occupied peoples in France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and beyond, the sight of Allied soldiers on their soil rekindled belief in liberation. For the Allies themselves, the success of D-Day proved that the tide of war had truly turned. As Eisenhower later reflected, D-Day was a victory not just of arms, but of faith. Faith that free men, united, could defeat tyranny. The strategic and political consequences of Normandy were clear. Germany's days were numbered. The Western Allies were now firmly on the road to Paris, the Rhine, and ultimately Berlin. The story of D-Day and the Battle of Normandy is not just a tale of strategy and armies. It is a story of sacrifice, endurance, and the will of nations. On June 6, 1944, and in the weeks that followed, men from over a dozen nations fought side by side on the soil of France. Americans, British, Canadians, Poles, Norwegians, French, and many others, united under one cause: to liberate a continent enslaved by tyranny. The cost was staggering. By the end of the Normandy campaign, the Allies had suffered over 200,000 casualties, killed, wounded, or missing. German losses were even higher, with nearly 500,000 men lost in 6 weeks of fighting. Tens of thousands of French civilians also perished, victims of bombings, crossfire, and reprisals. The fields, hedgerows, and towns of Normandy became cemeteries. Rows upon rows of white crosses and stars of David mark the sacrifice of a generation. Visitors who walk among them today can still feel the silence, the weight of history, the voices of those who never returned. The strategic results were undeniable. Paris was liberated by the end of August 1944. Belgium and the Netherlands followed, and the Allies crossed the Rhine into Germany by spring 1945. The road to Berlin, though still bloody, had been opened. Politically, D-Day marked the turning point in Western Europe. It demonstrated the unity of the Allies, the resolve of free nations, and the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. For the French people, it was the dawn of liberation, the return of hope after 4 years of occupation. Charles de Gaulle proclaimed, "France has lost a battle, but France has not lost the war." His words, once spoken in exile, now rang true in the streets of Paris. For the soldiers who survived, the memories of Normandy never faded. They recalled the fear of the beaches, the chaos of the hedgerows, the relief of finally breaking through. Many rarely spoke of it, carrying the burden silently for decades. For those who fell, their legacy lives on. The freedom of Europe, the defeat of fascism, the rebuilding of nations. all were made possible by their sacrifice. In Germany, the failure of Normandy sealed Hitler's fate. Though the war dragged on, his dream of domination was broken. The Reich that once seemed invincible was collapsing under the weight of Allied and Soviet advances. In the wider world, D-Day became a symbol of courage, of cooperation, of the power of unity in the face of darkness. It showed that tyranny could be resisted, and that freedom, though costly, was worth the price. Today, as we look back, the lessons remain. The bravery of ordinary men, the resilience of nations, the importance of alliance and trust. Normandy reminds us that history is shaped not only by leaders, but by the countless individuals who chose to stand and fight. As Eisenhower later wrote, "The eyes of the world were upon them. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere marched with them." And now, dear viewer, we ask you, when history demands courage, when freedom itself is at stake, will we, like those men on the beaches of Normandy, find the strength to rise?